Our next moderator, Professor John Maurer, who is our chair for the Strategy and Policy Department, for our last panel.
Thank you very much, Mike, for introducing me. It is my great privilege and honor to introduce the speakers of this panel this afternoon. They are a distinguished group of scholars and thinkers whose work is provocative, timely, and yet at the same time classic in what they do. So without further ado, I want to introduce each, giving just a brief statement about them because their bios are in the program. And our topic is to look at a moment of transition where we're looking at today's strategic environment, but thinking about future challenges as well as future opportunities. Our first speaker is Professor Andrew Bacevich. He is a professor at Boston University. He is a prolific author. His books are provocative, talking about the American experience of war and America's place in the world, America's foreign policy. He has written a number of exceptional articles as well that have provoked a great deal of thinking, discussion, debate. He's always provocative, but more importantly, always thoughtful in what he does. The second speaker is Professor Barry Posen, who is a professor of political science at MIT. He is also director of MIT's prestigious Security Studies program. He is an author of prize-winning books, numerous articles. His work indeed forms part of the required readings in our core curriculum here at the College on Strategy. Indeed, Barry and I were just reminiscing during the break that we first met here in the 1980s when there was discussion about the maritime strategy of that era. So he has been a close follower of naval affairs and maritime strategy over the last quarter century. Our third speaker is Professor Hugh White, who is Professor of Strategic Studies at Australian National University. He is not only a scholar, but he also understands very well indeed the policy-making realm, having served as the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. He has a forthcoming book called The China Choice, and indeed there was a glowing article about it in today's New York Times. So without further ado, I want to turn the stage over to our distinguished panelists. First, Professor Andrew Bacevich.
Well, thank you very much. A month ago, the Wall Street Journal published a fluff piece about Army Major General H.R. McMaster. And the article included the following quotation from General McMaster. He said, "We have a perfect record in predicting future wars, right? And that record is 0%. I concur with that judgment and would go further. The national security apparatus has an equally unimpressive record when it comes to anticipating whatever it is that's coming down the pike, or when it comes to understanding whatever crisis that we actually happen to confront. Count the times in just the past couple of decades where we've been caught utterly by surprise. The second-order consequences of supporting the Afghan Mujahideen during the time of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the reaction of Somali warlords to kind-hearted Western attempts at nation-building in Somalia back in 1993, the unveiling of nuclear weapons capabilities by North Korea and Pakistan, the events of 9/11, the non-existence of Saddam Hussein's WMD program, which the United States had touted as the principal rationale for engaging in preventive war. The consequences of actually then invading Iraq and overthrowing the Ba'ath regime, the Arab Spring. The older I get, the more inclined I am to say that the entire enterprise, commonly referred to as statecraft, is a fraud. Statesmen pretend to formulate and then to follow strategies. More often than not, however, they are merely attempting to cope with the unexpected. The key to successful coping is to have plenty of power to spare. Walter Lippmann famously wrote that the foundation of any foreign policy should be what he called solvency, making sure you've got enough power to satisfy your commitments. I've come to believe that solvency alone doesn't suffice. I'd argue for excess, having plenty more power than you think you are going to need. Nurturing and then husbanding this excess of power, call it solvency with lots to spare, was for a century and a half the central theme of U.S. national security strategy. This was long before the phrase national security strategy had even been invented. Seeking solvency with lots to spare vaulted the United States to a position of global preeminence. Whatever happened, no matter how big the surprise, we were able to cope because we possessed the necessary wherewithal, even if in latent form. Recall the abiding characteristic of U.S. policy during the 19th century. It was a strategy of expansionism. 100 years during which the United States seized a vast and richly endowed continent, swept aside any obstacle that would prevent us from exploiting what we'd taken, and then built an economy that was the envy of the world. America, it was said, was the land where the streets were paved with gold. Recall that during that century, the United States steered clear of great power competition and avoided wasteful and unnecessary military spending. Larger than necessary militaries don't create wealth. They consume it. 19th century Americans understood that. During the first half of the 20th century, we cashed in some of the chips we'd accrued during the previous 100 years, helped along by the recklessness of the Germans and the Japanese, and by the self-induced exhaustion of the Brits and the French, perhaps helped above all by the courage and stamina of the Russian soldier during World War II, we really hit the jackpot. By the time I was born in 1947, we had it all. Economic supremacy, vast reserves of moral credibility, an effective democratic government, dynamic political institutions, substantial self-sufficiency and critical resources to include oil, and more than adequate military power to keep us safe. To oversimplify only slightly, it's been downhill ever since. Certainly, it's been downhill since the debacle of Vietnam, and since 9/11, the slopes become steeper still. Indeed, the whole effort on the part of the United States to dominate or liberate or pacify the greater Middle East, whatever it is we're trying to do, has basically been an exercise in squandering power for little return. Now, today, it's probably true that we remain the richest and most powerful country in the world. But we are also a country that hasn't had a trade surplus in 4 decades. The national debt is as large as the entire economy and continues to mushroom. The federal deficit has exceeded $1 trillion for several years running. The economy has stagnated. The government in Washington is manifestly dysfunctional. And oh yes, we have the best and easily the most expensive military establishment in the world, but it's one that sadly does not actually win wars, despite its very commendable and costly exertions. There's something wrong here that a pivot toward Asia is not going to fix, even if you believe that people in Washington possess the ability to accurately anticipate the course of events in that part of the world, which they don't. I don't pretend to know what the future holds. My guess is that we are witnessing the emergence of a multipolar global order in which the United States is going to be one among several powers that will have a say in running things. On the roster of powers that can't be ignored will be China and India, probably Korea, Russia, Japan, and some sort of European entity, perhaps Turkey and Brazil. The actual pecking order of power will vary. Each one of these players will experience ups and downs, as will we. Of surprises, there will be plenty. What's critically important, if we are to hold our own, is that we reconstitute the sinews of national power so that we once again possess that solvency with lots to spare, enabling us to cope with the inevitable surprises. People who think that the size of the Pentagon budget determines the well-being of our nation are deluded. That's the wrong index. The crying need is to get our house in order, to renew our basic institutions, and to reinvigorate our economy. If we fail to do so, then American decline will become unavoidable and irreversible. And all the speculation about Asia that passes for strategic debate won't matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Our second speaker is Professor Barry Posen.
You know, when I go to meetings at 4 o'clock, I often find myself nodding off and wishing the person who was droning on would just be quiet. And then I often realize that the person droning on is me. One of the pleasures you get from teaching. I've been working for several years now on a book that has 3 parts. One part is a critique of U.S. grand strategy as it's been practiced in the last 20 years. One part is a suggestion for an alternative, and one part tries to rough out what a force structure would look like. I call the present grand strategy of the United States liberal hegemony, small l liberal hegemony. It's hegemonic because the United States seeks to have quite a lot of influence across the globe on many, many issues, and liberal because it's not a hegemony that's built on direct occupation or direct domination. It's built on influence, on control of rules, of institutions, some coercion, spreading democracy, spreading market economies. So it's basically liberal hegemony. Right? Now, just to foreshadow, I don't think that this strategy, which I will critique in detail in a second, is really necessary. And I don't think it's necessary because I think the United States, despite the many problems that it's facing presently, still has vast capability. And essentially, we are a quite secure country. It's easy to forget that the oceans that these institutions that we're talking about today sail across and often control, that those oceans are a terrific buffer for the United States, have been since our birth, still are. It's easy to forget that nuclear weapons, which frighten us terribly when they could be in the hands of non-state actors, nevertheless make it all but inconceivable that another great power could consider the conquest of the United States, or for that matter, that we could consider the conquest of another great power. The U.S. is, as many have pointed out, still quite a rich country with a very diverse economy. not so popular perhaps in this room is that a big chunk of America's world trade is actually not with distant shores, it's with our neighbors to the north and south. And that trade is nice because it gives us access to a much bigger hinterland with lots of raw materials, which again improve the autonomy of the United States. The United States is very strong conventionally. We've funded institutions lushly for decades and decades to produce the finest military technology in the world, which the Americans still have, and which gives us an extra edge in anything that we do. So the United States is inherently a remarkably secure country. And if we had very little foreign policy and very little activity abroad to speak of, we would still be a very, very secure country. Now, I'm not an isolationist. I've recommended a grand strategy that my friend and mentor Harvey Sapolsky has been calling restraint for almost 15 years. I came to the party late. I used to believe in a different grand strategy. My interpretation of this grand strategy is that we should focus on a small number of very fundamental potential security problems, some of them more imminent than others, but these are the ones that seem fundamental to me. One is traditionally the United States has been concerned about maintaining a balance of power in Eurasia. There's not much chance of that balance of power being overturned for a whole bunch of reasons right now, even given China's dynamism. But that said, the United States should always keep a weather eye on that balance of power and maintain the capability to be involved in Eurasian politics if we must. Second, a new problem, a creature and part of globalization, is the damage that terrorists that have global ambitions can wreak on the United States of America. So we have to have some regular effort to be able to suppress these kinds of organizations, with Al-Qaeda being the most obvious, but I think we should be aware that in the future there may be more. And finally, given their fundamental importance, their fundamental danger, right, we always have to be paying attention to nuclear weapons in the world and how they're managed. How they're managed in terms of great power relations and middle power relations, but also the emergence of new nuclear powers. How does that happen? Why does that happen? What can be done about it, if anything, right? Now, all of these three problems, which are, you could devote quite a big share of GDP to chasing these problems down. In the grand strategy, the issue is not just to name your problems, it's to think systematically about means and ends and constraints and priorities and all that kind of thing, right? So in thinking about these problems, we can be very, very energetic, we can spend and misspend a great quantity of resources, or we can be somewhat more judicious. I tend to be in the school that says the United States is presently doing too much and could stand to do a bit less, right? So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what it is that's been bothering me about the grand strategy of liberal hegemony in terms of the way it has unfolded in the last 20 years, and problems that I think will likely persist and make the strategy ever more expensive to implement. So the first issue, and it's been talked about already today, is that we haven't had much of a sense of resource scarcity. We talk about national security largely as if resources were going to be there if we needed them, right? So even though presently we're talking about a $500 billion cut, which is actually a missing $500 billion increase in the defense budget, not a $500 billion cut, we still have a pretty big defense budget, and we expect it to be there, and we expect to be able to do a lot of things with it. And when we have discussions about new interventions and new wars, I don't hear people reminding us, oh, by the way, right, our bankroll's a little short right now. When people talk about intervening in Syria, which is very live issue right now, I don't hear people talking about that. I don't hear people talking about the possible ripple effects of a war with Iran over their nuclear weapons. It's just not the way we think, but we should, right? If you follow the arguments, say, of the Congressional Budget Office, which seems to be our scorekeeper of record, to make the national accounts come out right, we need to move around 6 or 8% of GDP if we start now, through raising taxes or cutting spending. 6 or 8% of GDP. If we wait a couple more years, the price goes up. And if you wait even more years, not too many, you can get up to 12% of GDP. This is a lot of GDP to move around. By the way, parentheses, if we cut the whole defense budget, we still couldn't solve this problem. So the defense budget, I'm guessing, will probably need to be a bill payer, almost surely a bigger bill payer than the $500 billion we're talking about today, right? But it can't solve the whole problem. Every corner of America is going to have to pony up something, right? That means the kind of grand compromise that sometimes makes this country work. Sometimes we can't make those grand compromises and the country doesn't work. So far we haven't made the compromise, it hasn't worked. Be that as it may, right, we have a big political economic issue that we have to address. And we're only getting into a serious conversation about these trade-offs. It's been obvious or understandable from the point of bureaucratic politics that the present leadership of the Pentagon simply won't think about administering sequestration if it happened, just don't want to think about it. It's too painful. The implications have been painted as catastrophic. Smart bureaucratic politics, but real life is real life. Sequestration may happen, and even if sequestration doesn't happen, somebody's going to come after that $500 billion over the next decade, I'm guessing, unless the international community changes a lot. The international environment changes a lot and becomes much more threatening, which means that we have to get serious about serious cuts. So far what we've seen, and I think we heard brilliant expositions today, about things we're doing to try and do about as much as we've been doing with somewhat less than we've had to do it with, right? This is only the beginning, I think, of where we're going, driven by resource scarcity. Second problem is a problem that you see talked about, particularly by the National Intelligence Council, the last two big reports they've done, the World in 2025 and the new draft, which will be out shortly, the World in 2030. This is a problem called the diffusion of power, which has many facets, right? One aspect of it is that other countries are getting wealthy. You heard about it this morning from Ian, right? Other countries are getting wealthy, right? Which means that our ability, our weight, the shadow we cast is going to be shorter, right? Which is going to make the kind of expansive strategy that we've had harder to implement. So the gap between the U.S. and other consequential powers seems to be shrinking. The second thing that I think is shrinking is the gap between consequential powers and everybody else. Other folk out there in the world are going to our universities, getting science and engineering degrees, learning stuff online, and becoming clever competitors in their own way. If not economically, then militarily, right? So that's second, right? And then third, this problem that people call failed states. It seems to be true that at least some states, usually the ones that left the Cold War small and weak to start with, either because they were new creations as a consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or they were states that had been propped up by the geopolitical competition of the Americans and the Soviets, bennying up these regimes that really didn't have very much capacity. A lot of weakened regimes, which means there can be a lot of these potential failed states where you can find all kinds of trouble of one kind or another to attract your attention for either reasons of counterterror or reasons of humanitarianism or ideology or whatever, right? So I don't think so far we've really assimilated the implications of the diffusion of power for our strategy and how it's going to make the strategy harder to implement and more costly to implement. Third is our military activity, when we do it, our wars are costly. Now, thankfully, right, we've managed to move those costs, some of them, at least some of the more obvious ones, from the human side of the ledger to the dollar side of the ledger, right? But there's a riddle or a puzzle that needs to be solved. In real bucks, the United States spent as much in Iraq as it spent in Vietnam, in real dollars. Now, how is this possible, right? In Vietnam, the United States faced not only a country as a sanctuary, North Vietnam, a sanctuary and base for the people we were fighting, right, and mobilization base, but they had open MasterCard accounts in the arsenals of the Soviet Union and China, right? Now, that's not the kind of adversary that the Americans encountered in Iraq. And yet the dollar cost exchange ratio is much, much worse. I'd say by a factor of 10, right? So I think this may have something to do with this business about others getting smarter. It has something to do with the extent to which we either do or do not involve the rest of the population of the United States in these wars. But whatever it is, right, if small determined groups of people can impose $750, $800 billion worth of costs on the United States, basically reaching the level of 1% of GDP per year, imagine what happens if you make one more mistake than you expected, a la the statements that have been made today about your inability to predict. You can stumble into a much bigger buzzsaw than we stumbled into, right? And this cuts to a question about how we think about war in this country. I mean, I think it was maybe it was you this morning, Bob, who were talking about war years, war months, right? We've become quite cavalier about going to war in this country. And when I say we, I don't mean folk in uniform who are always the first to sort of think, I think, sensibly about these things, but we as civilians, and academics, norms entrepreneurs, right? People who want to intervene for humanitarian reason, non-proliferation reason, whatever. This argument that what do we have this big military power for if we're not going to use it? This has become kind of second nature to the thinking of many, many people in the national security establishment. I'm old-fashioned, right? I read Clausewitz. War is a club, right? And you're not going to get fine-grained results from it. And you should be pretty judicious about when you use it. And it's hard for me to see how a country that's as secure as the United States is, given these facts or factoids that I've laid out earlier, needs to be as energetic as we have been, right? Parentheses. I believe there's also an indirect cost to the fact that the Americans are always at war. And I think we're teaching others too much. Right? These insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, are Darwinian schools for junkyard dogs. The bad guys who survive these things, they go to other insurgencies. They travel across borders. They teach the tricks that they learn in one place to their friends. Right? We're running a kind of a national training center. And we should think hard about how much of what we laboriously learn we want to be teaching in others in wars that actually may not be vital interest for the United States of America, right? All this activism may also energize another phenomenon. I belong to the hoary old school of international politics called balance of power theorists, right? And if you're out there in the world strutting your stuff with your power, pressing, trying to expand your power and influence, other capable states tend to get nervous, right? That doesn't mean that we don't get nervous when other capable states do the same. This is the natural order of things, right? But we should ask ourselves, is all this energy that we put into the international system causing others to concert their actions against us, right? To me, it's not so miraculous that China and Russia don't have really tight alliance relations. To me, what's miraculous is that they have any alliance relations. Right? For us to be able, and I think it's us, to drive China and Russia together on anything, to me it's striking because inherently these two countries should be at each other's throats. In the fullness of time, maybe they will be, right? So I think we cause others to balance against us, and maybe a little bit less forward policy would inhibit some of this propensity. I think we also have to be sensitive to something else. I don't want to say, I'm not sure that what I'm about to say is true. But I'm not sure I heard the word nationalism once today, but if I did hear it today, I heard it once or twice, right? Now, we are living in an age of Renaissance nationalism and have been since the end of the Soviet Union, right? Probably beforehand. Nationalism never disappeared. People wanted to believe that it did, but we've been living in an age of Renaissance nationalism, right? And my friend Steve Van Ever likes to say nationalism's the atomic energy of modern politics, right? This is a very energetic force, right, for groups who believe that they're under some kind of threat, whether that threat's a military threat or a political threat. When groups think they're under threat, they tend to pull together. And when they pull together, they can be quite ferocious, right? Some of our activity seems to energize nationalism, at least in some parts of the world. In the Arab world in particular, the United States continues to be not very popular, at least that's my understanding, right? And this is the place where we actually have, in some sense, the most work to do somehow, right, to get the folk that were talked about earlier, I think Bob Lee was talking about earlier, the entrepreneurs in these societies who are upset, angry, and looking for somebody to blame, to get them to blame somebody else besides us. We make it easy for others to blame us because we're in everybody's face, right? And again, this is something that we should consider, right? Nationalism is something you want to be very wary of. When these insurgencies that we've been involved in, one of the reasons others pull together against us is because other nations don't like being occupied. Even our friends and allies in these countries at some point begin to think that, maybe it's time for us to go, right? So this project of ours runs headlong into a lot of Renaissance nationalism, which I think in many ways is tied to globalization, because we have very intense, very rapid social change, which disrupts traditional societies and creates a lot of volatile politics, right? And people often take refuge in traditional notions of identity. This is fertile ground for nationalist politicians and worse, terrorists. Then the final problem I want to talk about, you can use different terms for it. I'm sure to insult someone in the room, but I usually do. In the last financial crisis, we heard a lot about moral hazard, right? Moral hazard. It's when you provide insurance policies to others that are so generous that others engage in risky behavior, right? U.S. government backing the banks would be an example of this kind of thing. The liberal hegemony project creates vast amounts of strategic moral hazard, which produces behaviors on the parts of other states of two kinds. And these are our friends, by the way, behaviors on the part of our friends, right? One form is cheap riding, right? I heard a lot of discussions this morning about the credibility of U.S. commitments. How do we convince people that American commitments are credible? We've been obsessed with the credibility of our commitments since the end of the Cold War, right? I think if you look objectively at the behavior of our allies, our problem is not that they doubt the credibility of our commitments. I think our problem is our allies assume the credibility of our commitments. Our commitments are incredibly credible, right? And people bankroll those commitments from us, and they go off and they do what they want. The Europeans have been cutting their defense budgets, basically like this since the Cold War ended, and they're going to cut them some more to deal with the economic crisis, right? Secretary of Defense Gates did what some secretaries of defense do with their one foot out the door is when it happens. SecDef has one foot out the door. They rail against the NATO allies as they're leaving the building, and that's the last railing you hear. The next Secretary of Defense comes in and says wonderful things about the allies for 4 or 8 years, and then as they're leaving the building, they rail against the inadequate commitments of the allies. The allies do about as much as they think they have to do, right? And they don't think they have to do much because the United States is there to bankroll them. Same is true of Japan. Now, I don't like saying mean things about Japan under the circumstances because they've had a very bad year. But the Japanese were underspending before they had their bad year, right? They've been underspending, underinvesting for, since the Cold War ended. And I find it extremely odd that countries in Asia, not all, but some, spend a lot of time worrying and trying to worry us about the impending threat from China, but then you look at what they're doing to deal with the impending threat from China, and they're not doing that much, right? So this is a big problem for us. We do more, our allies do less, right? And I don't think that should be counted as a success. Then the flip side of it is we have allies who have their own projects, and they undertake their own projects with wild abandon, apparently secure in the belief that one way or the other will be there to backstop them. And some of those allies either are or have been governments of Iraq, the years that we were there, the present government of Afghanistan, not presently, but the preceding nationalist government in Taiwan, Georgia, and Israel. These are all countries that they have projects or things they do want to do or don't want to do, things that are reckless for them, and in some cases reckless for us. They do them. We have almost no influence over them, right? So these are the problems that I think have been inherent in the liberal hegemonic project, which I think we need some other kind of grand strategy to do something about, which is why I think we need a grand strategy of restraint. Now I should close with just a bit of perspective on what I'm saying here and why I'm saying it. I have never, since I started advocating this idea, been naive about its adoption, right? I don't expect a eureka moment by a president or a political candidate or some future national security advisor say, eureka, we should pursue a grand strategy of restraint, which in its implementation is rather significantly different from our present grand strategy. That's not what I expect. I have basically three reasons for doing this. One, I think there's been way too little debate about the grand strategy of the last 20 years. We've been debating around the edges, right? We've been debating little bits and pieces of means, right? Whereas I think what we need to do is have a conversation about the whole project, right? And we can only have that conversation if someone presents a different project, right? In America or anywhere else, you can't beat something with nothing, right? So we have to come up with some sort of conceptual framework of an alternative that at least gives us a point of purchase to have a dialogue with the strategy as it's been implemented. Second, I think of the old fire axe that you used to see in some buildings. In case of fire, break glass. That's what it is. There's an axe there. I don't know what you're going to do with the axe, but the axe was there, right? So I think of this as something like that. This financial crisis we had some people who were really smart and had steady nerves running the show when the crisis broke. And we're damn lucky we did, right? But it could have gone the other way, right? And had it gone the other way, I'm not sure we would be having the conversation about pivots to Asia or anything else that we're having today, right? We might be having a conversation about pivot to to Hawaii, right? That might be the conversation we'd be having, because our bankroll would be a lot shorter. And I think the tolerance of the American people for the present grand strategy would be a lot lower. Now, if such a thing ever happens, I think it would be better for us to have done some conceptual thinking in advance about how we would get by with a much shorter bankroll in a very different world. And finally, if those who say that the world is changing are right, in other words, if it's not so much a point about American decline, right? It's a point about change, that other states are coming into the modern world. The distribution of economic power in the world is probably going to change, and therefore the distribution of political power is probably going to change. We may find ourselves incrementally adapting away from the strategy that we have, and we may need to know what we're adapting toward, right? And I think it's a good time to start laying out a different star by which we could navigate if in the event the seas begin, pushing us in that direction. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Barry, for that presentation. Our third speaker is Professor Yu White.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Mr. President, Admiral Christensen. It's a great pleasure and honour to be here. It's a particular pleasure and honour for an Australian to stand on a podium at the US Naval War College. No country in the world has benefited more from US power than Australia over the last century. And for we in Australia, because we're an island continent, that means mostly the Navy. So what's been done here over the last century and a half has been incredibly important to my country, and the work that will be done here will be incredibly important to my country in future. As an Australian, I'm going to offer you a Western Pacific view, not exactly an Asian view, because whether Australians are Asians or not is one of those unresolved questions. Watch this space. But I will offer you a view from the front line of what I think we'd probably all agree is America's biggest strategic challenge. That challenge is in Asia, and today, and for the next couple of decades at least, it will be China. Now, there's been a lot of focus, I know, particularly in the USN and the Air Force, about how to respond to that at the operational level, operational concepts for structures, deployments, and budgets, of course. But there is always a prior question. The prior question is about strategic objectives. What is the United States trying to do in Asia strategically over the next couple of decades? And I don't think the US has quite decided this yet. At least I'd certainly say, and here I very much agree with the point that Professor Posen made, I don't think if it's decided it has decided it without debating it. And if that's true, that's a bad idea, because this is an incredibly important decision for America and an incredibly important decision for Asia. And to decide it without debating it, decide it without really understanding what you are getting yourselves into, I think would be a serious mistake. On the other hand, the US has adopted a working hypothesis. The working hypothesis is that its strategic objective in Asia over the next few decades is to retain the position it's enjoyed for the last few decades. That is primacy. Now, you'll never hear me speaking against American primacy for what it's done for Asia. The last 40 years in Asia, the decades since 1972, when US primacy in Asia has been effectively uncontested by any major Asian power, have been the best 4 decades in Asia's history. And we're talking about an Asian century today because of the way in which US primacy enabled the development of Asia, including China, which has provided the necessary, not the sufficient, but the necessary conditions for the remarkable things that we're seeing there. But the question is not then whether US primacy has been good in the circumstances of the last 4 decades. It's whether it's going to keep working in the new circumstances of the next few decades. Now let me just spend a minute setting the scene, and I'm going to do this very quickly and therefore probably very contentiously. China's rise is the biggest shift in relative national power in history. It will overtake the United States economically quite soon, and it doesn't stop there. There are serious economists who will argue that by 2040, which is, I think as somebody said, before my mortgage is paid off, by 2040, China's economy could be twice the size of America's. Now that seems to us, it seems to me, almost unthinkable, but it is the product of the brutal arithmetic of per capita productivity times the size of the workforce. And a $1.3 billion person population produces a workforce which, even by America's immense scale, is pretty hard to beat. The second point, now it's worth making the point, this is not a story of American decline. I don't for a moment believe that America is a declining state. It's a country of enormous inherent power, and not just the power of its size, so that counts. It's a story of China's rise, and that's a different story. Now, that economic weight will produce strategic and political power, not in a simple way, not in a direct and a mechanical way, but in the long term. Although national power has lots of manifestations, it has only one ultimate source, and that is the scale of its economy. So we better believe that China is not going to just be a very rich country, but a very powerful one indeed. Don't underestimate China. The third point to make is that China is ambitious. I don't doubt for a moment that it wants to lead Asia. I think the Chinese are a long way from deciding what kind of leadership they want in Asia, but I don't doubt for a moment they want to lead Asia. If they can. They are at the very least determined to be a great power in Asia. And that means, amongst other things, treated essentially as an equal by the United States. On the other hand, China, though it will be very strong, won't rule the world. It won't be a lonely superpower. It will be a country that's surrounded by a lot of other very strong states. India, of course, treading on its heels. Japan, still, I think, a country of immense strategic potential. Other very significant Asian countries like Indonesia. Russia, still a very significant factor in any Chinese strategic calculations. And, of course, the United States. I don't worry for a moment that China will rule the world. But in Asia, it will be extremely formidable. Its strategic attention is focused there, unlike America's, which remains a global power. It has the advantages of being the local power rather than having to project power across such a wide ocean. And its interests there are very intense, just like America's interests in the Western Hemisphere are very intense. For China, its ocean littoral is like what the Caribbean is for the United States. They really care about this stuff. And it's worth bearing in mind that just on economic grounds, China will be more formidable than any state the United States has ever dealt with before, since it became a world power. Indeed, maybe since it took on the Brits in 1812. Because it's the first power the United States has ever had to deal with that has the prospect of having a bigger economy than America's. So what are America's options for the way it defines its strategic objectives in Asia in the face of this power? Of course, the best outcome, certainly the best outcome from an Australian point of view, would be for uncontested primacy to continue indefinitely. We've never had it so good. I fear we'll never have it so good again. But that's not going to happen because China is contesting America's primacy right now, and I don't believe it's going to stop. So there are three options. The first is contested primacy. The Chinese want a competition, America can say yes, you can have that competition, and America can compete with China for primacy in Asia. The second option is to negotiate a new order with China, deal with China as an equal partner if China is willing to do that, if China is prepared to moderate its ambitions to do that. And the third option is for the United States to withdraw from Asia. Leave it to the Asians, and maybe the Australians, to fight it out amongst themselves. I think America has assumed that primacy, contesting with China for primacy, is the best option without noting how different contested primacy over the next few decades would be from the uncontested primacy of the last few decades. Because contested primacy is a completely different proposition. It's much more costly and much more risky. So that assumption must be considered, and I think it needs to be considered very carefully. In considering that, obviously the military component will be a key element. And I know a lot of work's been done here and elsewhere in the US system about that. Let me say a word about that. The military foundation of American primacy in Asia has been its capacity to project power by sea. And I'm not saying that just because I'm here at the Naval War College. And a necessary condition for that is its capacity to achieve sea control against any of the regional powers. And therefore the military implication of a strategic assumption about maintaining primacy in Asia is a need to maintain that capacity for sea control. And of course the biggest capacity to America's sea control in the Western Pacific is China's growing A2AD capabilities. Now, to respond to that, the US has developed ideas like the air-sea battle, which I think are very innovative and interesting. But as those ideas have developed, a few things have become clear. The first is that to regain sea control, the United States must undertake a major campaign early in the conflict to degrade China's sea denial capability. That involves extensive strikes on China's territory and systems at the start of the war. That risks, no, it guarantees escalation to a major war with China at immense, almost unthinkable economic costs, and at the risk of escalation to a nuclear conflict. That raises the threshold of US action in the Western Pacific. It raises the questions of what US interests in Asia justify running those kinds of risks, and of course raises doubts in allies' minds as to the circumstances under which America will really accept those risks and go to war with China. Now, I assume that the air-sea battle can succeed in delivering sea control back to the United States through that escalatory process. But even then, I'm not sure it gets us home. Because in the end, sea control is just a means to something else. It's a means to allow power projection. And the second question I think American strategy must ask is, what are the forces that America is going to project into the Asian theatre, having achieved sea control, which can achieve a decisive strategic outcome in a conflict with China? Because China's not Iraq. There are not very many things I'm sure of, but I'm sure as anything that the big red one, not even the US Marines, are going to march across Tiananmen Square again. They have been there once, of course. I'm not quite sure how, even if we achieve sea control at the cost of this very risky escalation, the US can terminate a war with China on terms that looks like a victory for the United States. The conclusion I draw is that the air-sea battle interesting though it is not going to be enough to sustain US primacy in the face of China's opposition. And that's not just because of the budget cuts. Even if the US defence budget was continuing on the trajectory of the last decade, I think the basic operational and geographical challenges combined with China's increasing capabilities would make that the case. So what does this mean? The bad news is that I don't think the United States can sustain sea control in the Western Pacific. The good news is that China can't either. The good news is that Corbett, 100 years ago, made the argument that a country can lose sea control without the other guy necessarily gaining it. It's quite possible to have a maritime environment in which no country can use the sea safely, which both countries, all countries, can deny it to the others. And I think we're entering into just this kind of world. And that's reinforced, I think, by technological and operational asymmetries between sea control and sea denial as maritime operations. So that means that China can't establish primacy in the Western Pacific either. I just hope they understand that. Now let me just say a bit about allies and friends. Let me give you the view from the Western Pacific. Everyone in Asia except China, wants America to stay engaged in Asia because everyone in Asia does fear how China might use its power. But nobody in Asia wants to live with the consequences of escalating strategic competition between the US and China. The economic consequences, because all of us, including Australia, see China as our economic future. But also we don't want to live with the strategic implications. We don't want to live in a battlefield between the US and China. We don't want to be drawn into a battlefield if that can be avoided. So everyone wants America to stay. But everyone wants America to stay on terms which avoid that escalating strategic competition. In other words, on terms which are acceptable to China. And everyone wants China to accept that America must stay on terms that are acceptable to America. Both sides have to move. From the point of view of people in the Western Pacific, there is a choice of US primacy in competition with China or a smaller but still very significant US balancing role in cooperation with China, it's the easiest choice going. We'd all take option 2. Not that we wouldn't prefer uncontested US primacy, but that's not what's available. So in what's available, a balancing role in cooperation with China would be our preference. So what does this mean for US aims, strategic aims in Asia? Well, the first thing to remember is that there are not 2 options, but 3. It's not just withdrawal or compete with China. There is a third option, a possibility for a negotiated, shared strategic order in Asia, in which the US plays a central role, but in which China also plays a central role. How that might work is a huge question, and it would take me a long time to give you even my views on it. But I've been very struck by how just over the last few weeks even, there's the beginnings of a discussion in America about how that might work. Hillary Clinton gave a fascinating speech in early March at the US Institute of Peace, talking about the need for America and China to work together to build a new order in Asia. Henry Kissinger, I think, in his piece in Foreign Affairs in the March-April edition, also started to move in this direction in very interesting ways. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a different kind of relationship than America has ever had with a great power before, but that's because China's a different kind of great power than America has ever dealt with before. And though it will be hard, I would argue it won't be as bad as the alternatives. Strategic competition with a country as formidable as China is a terrible thing to take on if it can be avoided. And withdrawal from Asia, I would say, though I can understand the temptations, would I think in the end be bad for America's interests, and I know it would be disastrous for us in Asia. So I think this option of negotiating a shared order in Asia is an option which the US must explore to test if China is willing before it decides to compete with China for primacy. But however it happens, if that can be achieved, US military power in Asia will be essential. This is a conception of a future Asian strategic order in which the United States military power continues to play a central role, because I really don't believe there's any peaceful future with Asia without that central role for the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those perceptive comments. Now I'll open it up to the floor. I see one hand here and then another one right here as well, and then a third. First right here.
Thank you for that very excellent presentation. Paul Daly from Boston. As we look at reset and we're looking at the role of China, the assumption has been throughout the day that we are going to be able to do this without much hindrance around the world. And I think that that is forgetting about the Middle East, Iran, and Israel, where Israel's prime minister is trying to stoke up not just his people and party, but the United States Congress to do something, either make war or do something short with Iran. And secondly, if we don't do it, he will do it. So would you comment on just how you see our situation in the Middle East, particularly Iran and Israel, on our new strategic policy?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I tend to think that despite all the overheated rhetoric that a war with Iran is not in cards, I think that the stupidity of a war with Iran from our point of view is ought to be pretty clear even in Washington, and that therefore in that particular case the self-restraint that Barry Posen calls for, I think, is likely to occur. Of course, the sort of the joker in the deck, as you suggested, would be the government of Israel, which certainly does have a tradition of reckless initiatives when the government of Israel feels itself threatened. But my guess is, in this case, again, setting aside the rhetoric that we hear from the Prime Minister and his defense minister, is that Israel won't act. And I'll tell you why. Because Israel is increasingly isolated in the world. Israel's dependence, therefore, on the United States as its principal protector becomes all the greater. And I would think that Israeli decision makers would have to take very seriously the possibility that an Israeli attack on Iran that then caused adverse effects for us could put the U.S.-Israeli relationship at serious risk. That the generalized popular support for Israel could be undercut in a moment if that Israeli attack on Iran caused a major backlash that hurt us. And I would think that sober Israeli strategists would take that very much into account and therefore would think not just twice but like 5 times before launching a preventive war against Iran.
Any of the other panelists? Barry?
What he said. But, you know, there's a couple of other factors that might, you know, help moderate the situation. One is, as far as I can tell, there's a difference of opinion in the Israeli establishment, and there's many senior, mostly former national security officials, but I presume they're still well connected and represent some trains of thought inside the country who believe that an Israeli attack would be a mistake. And second, I can't claim to be an expert on this, but people I talk to try and look at the actual mechanics of the attack, no one doubts the Israelis can get there and drop some bombs and look good on paper or look good on video, but some of the targets are pretty hard and some of the Iranian program is probably well distributed. So it's not clear to me how effective such a strike would be, which also might be a moderating force on Israeli decision-making. And this raises the question of, you know, then why do they talk about it? Why does Netanyahu talk about it? Partly, I guess, to get us to do more, but if the strike has a purpose, it has the purpose of, I think, engaging the United States in the war. I think it'll be hard for us to sit the war out once it starts. So this runs a high risk. If other people in Israel, in their establishment, see it this way and understand it, this runs a very high risk, right? Running your national strategy in a way that you're going to try and commit the United States to a war that either it doesn't want to have altogether or doesn't want to have now, doesn't think is necessary now, would really be a high-risk operation. I mean, this really does run risks for the relationship. So I think there's a lot of sources of moderation in the issue space, but there's also some sources of immoderation in the issue space. You know, the president has said I think too explicitly and too many times that containment and deterrence are not options for dealing with Iran. Practically speaking, of course they're options. I mean, you know, we and coalition partners in the region could detain and deter Iran quite handily. There's some irreducible risk there, but there's always some irreducible risk. But the president has got his neck stuck pretty far out on this. And the Iranians don't seem that hesitant. So there's a very slowly ticking clock attached to progress in the Iranian program. And it's not clear how you walk back the cat, given things that have been said by the United States, by senior United States leaders. So I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic on this thing. I think if there's a war, I won't be that surprised. If there isn't a war, I'll be happy, and I guess I won't be that surprised either. It seems to me this thing is balanced on more of a knife edge than it should be. And the question is why? That's the fundamental question that needs to be answered. Why is this balanced on such a knife edge?
My name is Rudy Anding, a retired German diplomat living in Miami. I'd like to tag on to Professor Batzevich's remarks on dubious statecraft. There are some writers who have argued that virtually all military interventions by the United States in the post-World War II period, with the possible exception of the Korean War, were elective wars. And they have not caused much more security for the United States and have had negative effects sometimes on the perception of the United States in the rest of the world. I would like to hear your comments on this perception, in particular in view of recent wars. Professor Posen very provocatively said that even if the whole military budget would be cut, this nation would not be that much less safe. This morning, Secretary Work said that the Navy has just enough money to do whatever is necessary. The day is just about over. I've heard nothing, or very little, about any threat assessment. What is the threat that you have to fight, and what is necessary to fight and to counter a possible threat?
Well, if I said that I thought the country would be secure if the entire defense budget was cut, that's not what I meant to say. What I said is we couldn't balance the budget if the entire defense budget was cut. What I did say is the United States is inherently very secure, and the United States could be defended with a much smaller budget. I think as the day goes on tomorrow, maybe, I think you're going to have Bob work with you again tomorrow, and maybe, I'm not going to be here, but Bob may want to get his licks in, and and talk a little bit about the difference between his vision and mine. But because of constraints of time, I didn't go through and sort of chapter and verse what are some of the differences between say where I stand and where the government stands. But I think that what you heard this morning about the things that need to be done is a very expansive list. And I don't mean expansive in the sense of American expansionism, it's just a lot of things. And the question is, how many of these things do we really need to do, right? The example of the moment, which I think is objectively taking a turn, is we decided after 9/11 that our security depended upon not only knocking over some rogue state regimes, but pacifying and transforming those countries to be some other kind of state that we think would make us more secure. And as I mentioned, the dollar costs of this exercise have been very high, and the force structure implications of maintaining force and being to do it are also pretty serious. This is basically mostly a Marine and Navy, and to some extent, judging from some audience comments, Air Force show here. I mean, the Army is a service for which I feel some sympathy, because in the old NATO-Warsaw Pact days, I opposed the maritime strategy and supported build-ups in NATO, and my view has changed because the strategy has changed. But the Army is going to take a hit, and the hit is particularly if I'm right about more money needing to be found, the hit's going to be very significant, because there seems to be a dawning understanding that this particular link in our grand strategy chain was misdirected, and that even if failed states are a problem, occupation and reconstruction is not the solution, right? It's just too costly. So we have about a 45 brigade Army. I think the Army is, in the current cuts, we're talking about cutting 7 maneuver brigades or something like that. I think by the time we're done, we'll cut well over 7. And I'll just be honest, in the force structure that I tried to work up, I cut half of them. And I think once you take those internal stabilization measures out of the Army's budgets, or out of the Army's war plans purpose, then there really isn't that much for them to do. And that's the place where you're going to take the hit. Now, if you go chapter and verse across things that we're doing in our strategy and scratch your head and say, gee, what's this all about? I think you could find other places to make cuts, but the government obviously wouldn't agree. I happen to believe that the keys to the military command structure of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should be handed to whatever European state or European group wants them, right? And most American military power should be out of Europe. Bob put up a chart, I think, this morning saying 3 active brigades abroad. I don't know why there's any active brigades abroad. I don't see the point. Certainly don't see the necessity in Europe. These are rich countries, well able to defend themselves, facing almost no threat worthy of the name, which raises an important question. What exactly are we doing? Now, the argument has been made that they're the ones who show up for fights. And I have immense respect for those who did show up for the fight in Afghanistan, and for the European soldiers who paid with their lives. But their hearts weren't in it. The hearts of the state weren't in it. The states were there for very, I think, basic kinds of reasons, which is to keep us only as happy as they needed to keep us. And if we look at the trends in their forces are going to be less useful for some of these other projects. So I'm dubious about all the value here, but I also think that if we're a little less obvious about our commitments, the Europeans may be a little bit more eager to do some things to win our friendship, right? So there's a place where I think we could make some cuts, whereas the current government would think no. You heard a long story this morning and this afternoon about all the engagement opportunities, engagement in Africa, engagement here, engagement there, right? I'm not so worried about most of these countries, and I've never been fully persuaded of the advantage of all this engagement, right? Doesn't mean you shouldn't do any, but as far as I can tell, what we do by way of engagement is every year we do as much as we can, right? And the State Department has its lists, people in the Pentagon have their lists, allies have their preferences, and then we literally do as much as we can, right? And as much as we can is probably more than we can do, right? I think we run the force ragged. If it were up to me, I would structure our forces in a different way. Not necessarily is more logically defensible, but I would say, how many possible fights in the world that could conceivably matter to American national security have a priority that we should be worth devoting forces to them, right? What are the potential contingencies that could matter? And we should build our forces, as someone said this morning, for war. And then after we build them for war, we can ask how much presence can we get out of those forces without running them ragged? And that's your presence budget for the year, and not an exercise more. And so these are the kinds of principles I think we need to apply, and those how my principles differ maybe from the present government's principles.
I'd just like to respond very briefly to the issue about wars of choice. I think you can make the case that what we call the first Persian Gulf War was not a war of choice. It was a war of necessity. You can make that case if you define U.S. purposes as George Herbert Walker Bush defined them at the time, meaning that in the post-Cold War era that we had just entered, he wanted to begin establishing a set of international norms such that naked aggression would be viewed as unacceptable and would elicit a collective response. The problem with that argument is that whether or not the first President Bush actually believed it, if you place the first Persian Gulf War in a larger context of the pursuit of hegemony in the greater Middle East, then the whole thing falls apart. And more broadly speaking, if we look at our military misadventures in the region, then the argument that they have been wars of choice actually is a much more accurate description, I think.
There was another hand back there. Yes, right there.
Robert James, I'm a businessman in New York. Our national security policy, as talked about here today, seems to be to continue to be the world's policeman. This is no surprise here. The military, especially the Navy, says we should do this by forward power, forward bases. And this is certainly what Panetta was saying at the Shangri-La dialogue. He's going to send ships there and more Marines. It's quite clear what he intends to do. Now, it's hard to see any enemy we're talking about other than China. So, my question is this. Why does all our discussions today deal with the United States and China? Is there nobody that can help us? Or should we just do it all by ourselves? Is that in our interest?
Thank you. You want to take that one on?
Thanks, yes, it's a very good question. I think the answer depends a great deal on what the United States is trying to do and what China is doing. The worse China behaves, the more China makes it clear that it wants to establish over Asia what one might call a Stalinist-style hegemony, the more sure you can be that the countries of Asia around China will not just rally to America's support, but drag you into the fight with all the vigor we can. But conversely, the more they believe that there is a prospect of a negotiated order in Asia in which the United States continues to play a central role, but no longer plays the policeman role, as you mentioned. And the more countries in Asia suspect that the source of tension between the US and China is not insatiable Chinese desire for hegemony, but a continued American determination to maintain its primacy and not make space for China, then the less support America will have in Asia. Because, as I said in my remarks, all of us in Asia want the US to stay engaged, but none of us want to do it on the basis of escalating strategic competition with China, unless China's own conduct makes that inevitable. And difficult though China has been to get on with, I think, certainly would be my judgment, but I think more importantly the judgment of most people in Asia so far is that we're not yet sure we can't do that deal with China. And we don't want to let the option of doing that deal go. Because, of course, if China is determined to dominate Asia, then it will be the successor of the would-be hegemons that America has taken on and slain successively over the last century. But it would require an effort comparable. It would require an effort comparable to the First World War or the Second World War to do that, and it could be a nuclear exchange. So that's not a thing to take on at all lightly. And I think that the attitude you'll see in Asia was perfectly captured by an Indonesian that Kissinger quoted in that article I mentioned before, where he said, "Please don't leave us, but don't make us choose."
There were some hands over here, right there. Yes, you. Thank you.
My name is Mike Perks from Old Lyme. I've done a lot of traveling in the last few years to Europe and throughout the United States. And recently, in the last few years, I see an awful lot of Chinese tourists. And I'm just wondering, as the Chinese people become more and more exposed to Western democracy, whether or not that might cause some kind of internal strife, social unrest, whereby the communist regime in China may be severely challenged. And I would really like to have your thoughts on the possibility or probability that that might happen.
Thank you. You, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, sure. A pleasure again. A very good question. There are two points to be made here. The first is that I don't doubt at all, I should say, I don't regard myself at all as an expert on China, China's internal politics, but I spend a lot of time talking to people who are. So here's a slightly second-hand views. I don't doubt at all that China's political system is under exceptional pressure. No country in history has grown as far as China has grown with a regime as autocratic as China's is today. And so I think we can be sure that China's regime will have to adapt further. Mind you, it has already adapted a great deal. The Chinese Communist Party of today is a very different beast from the one that Mao presided over until his death, for example, in 1976, or that even Deng took over in the late 70s. But it will have to adapt further, and it could easily be the case that as that adaptation proceeds, the Chinese Communist Party loses its Leninist role, its central role. But the second point is that I think we need to be very careful not to assume that kind of political transition in China can't be managed. And in particular, that if it occurs, it will necessarily break China's economic growth. The fact is that what China's doing today is going through its industrial revolution. It's doing exactly what the Brits did in the late 18th century, what America followed very closely on its heels, and so on. Every country that goes through an industrial revolution goes through a political revolution, because an industrial revolution fundamentally redistributes power in the society. But the revolutions all take different forms. The British managed the most boring revolution in history. You guys did something a little bit more exciting. The French, of course, did it with great flair and panache. The Russians went all the way. China's going to have its revolution. But what happens with all of those industrial revolutions, all of those political revolutions, is even though they were very traumatic, none of them stopped the growth. Of course, it can, dip for a year or even a decade or two. But there's no reason for us to assume that it will turn China from its trajectory towards having, for a couple of decades, until the Indians catch up, the biggest economy in the world. And the third point, of course, is that we should be careful of assuming that a China that's political system goes through that sort of revolution, even if it therefore becomes more participatory, more democratic, more liberal and open, is necessarily less nationalist. At the heart, the Chinese believe they're a very special country. And they feel towards their country much as Americans do towards theirs. They don't feel towards their government the way Americans feel towards theirs, although, oh, well, let's not so sure about that. But you know what I mean. I mean, we all are infuriated by our government's Australian politics at the moment is absurd, but the fact is that people do, in all societies, look beyond the government to the country. And I think, you know, what we'd call patriotism when we talk about ourselves, and we call nationalism when we talk about our friends, and we call it jingoism when we talk about our enemies. It's all the same thing, and boy, have the Chinese got it in spades.
We have time for one more. I see a hand right there, and then that will be the last question, unfortunately. Why don't we go right here?
Okay, sir. I just have one question.
Is it for him or for me?
Why don't we take both questions, and then we'll conclude. First here and then there.
Compromise.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm going to try to be quick. How do you see framing the argument politically before we intervene from one of what we want to do to what we're likely to achieve? The example I have in mind is Libya. We replaced Gaddafi. All of us are happy with that. The government controls Tripoli. No democracy is there. Tribal militia run the countryside, and the al-Qaeda affiliates in Mali, northern Nigeria, and eastern Algeria have all been rejuvenated and reborn from arms and ammunition provided by Libyan counterparts. And the Egyptian military just intercepted an arms shipment crossing the border to jihadists in Egypt. So with that as kind of an example, how do you think we should shape the debate for our national strategy in terms of things of that nature?
Thank you, and then that comment question here, and then we'll get responses.
Actually, mine is a very similar segue, so it matches together. Two questions for one response. Richard Lobin from this fine institution, professor of African Studies. So naturally, I feel Africa is always neglected in the CSF, but anyway, my question is that relative to China, we've been talking about sort of mainland China, East Asia, the pivot point and so forth, but if we take a page from history, the principal conflicts in the Cold War, if this is somehow a rough model, were never in the main part of Russia or the main part of elsewhere, but they were typically, as the previous questioner raised, they were in Africa or conceivably in Cuba. And I used the examples of the conflicts, the Cold War conflicts in the Horn of Africa with Mengistu or with Siad Barre, perhaps in Sudan right today, or in Angola where there were clear proxy forces of the Soviet Union, or even China to some smaller extent, arrayed against American, Western, and sometimes colonial forces. So if you can marry these two questions, but throw out the Chinese peripheral aspect of how China will relate, or we will relate to China's presence outside of the main area.
Okay. Go ahead, you.
Let me address the Africa question very briefly. I think, you know, my reading of Cold War history is that the reason why those proxy wars broke out was that the Central Front was in the end pretty well managed. And so that was, Africa was where the two sides could afford to take the risk of a little bit of a clash through proxies, whereas on the inter-German border, no one was prepared to take that risk, thank heavens. So at the risk of sounding more cynical than I really am, I'd say I hope if the US and China find themselves clashing, it will be through proxy wars in Africa rather than through the non-proxy war on the Central Front in the Western Pacific. But I hope more that the US and China will find a way to manage their strategic competition down to the point that that doesn't, that kind of proxy war doesn't occur. However, I do think even on the most optimistic picture of the future trajectory of US-China relations, they are going to be competitors in all sorts of areas. And just as the European powers in the 19th century, they had a very complex and rocky, but in the end well-managed concert model of the way in which Europe worked, nonetheless competed fearsomely in the colonial world. I can easily imagine the same sort of thing happening. The French and the British nearly going to war in Fashoda. I think there's a kind of a metaphor with the way Africa in particular, but perhaps also, depending on what happens to the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America as a field for competition between them. All I can say is, again, speaking rather selfishly as someone from the Western Pacific, I hope that's where the proxy wars take place.
Just briefly on Libya, I mean, I think the perception that Libya was a great and economical success had the effect of sort of reviving an enthusiasm in some quarters for humanitarian intervention. And once we declared victory there, it basically has dropped out of the newspapers. But the considerations that you cite, I think, are a reminder that although there certainly are times when it's necessary to intervene for humanitarian purposes, that we shouldn't kid ourselves that stopping the killing solves the problem. And we also should, I think, be very careful not to draw too much from the Libya case the notion that it is a cost-free enterprise, that in fact, more often than not, it's going to end up costing more than anybody thinks going in, and more often than not in the Libya case, it's going to end up costing the lives of young Americans, and for that reason, it seems to me we should be very, very wary of that kind of action.
One of the tasks of a moderator, a task I do not relish, is to call an end to such a wonderful discussion that we've had. But one of the things that a moderator likes to do is to thank the panelists and you all for the wonderful questions and discussion that we've had. So join me in thanking the panelists.